I've just returned from uh, my home in Maine, that's on the shore, and that's where a lot of this began. And I had some really fascinating and interesting experiences. The thing that always takes me back a bit is they don't know when I'm coming, but some way they somehow they do. So I go up to my field, and I married my wife in this field. It's a beautiful field. And as soon as I got up there, within 10 seconds, three Pleiadian starcraft turned on. One was a hot golden white, hot golden white, and they began to move. And in the middle was a vermilion Pleiadian starship that moved much more slowly, much more leisurely, and took its time. And over the next 60 minutes, at least another 5 to 6 ships appeared. And to Marty's point, most often starcraft observation and or limited interaction is subtle. And I think they're in the subtle mode. And perhaps they're in the subtle mode because there are a lot more starships, in my experience, in our skies right now. And that was amazingly cool. But you always want a little more interaction than perhaps their security protocols or the level of ascension they are encouraging will allow. On the next night, we went out with my family. I went out with my brother-in-law and my cousin. We saw a very strong four ships, again, in that subtle mode. And when I say subtle, they're usually at a lower power mode. Usually they're illuminated, but they're not very bright, typically 8 to 9,000 feet in altitude. And for the next hour and a half, we're all looking, we're hoping more happen or more starships appear. And I kept saying to my cousin, who's not very familiar with this subject, but fascinated by it, I kept sharing with him, if you see a strobe occur in the sky, that's pretty dispositive because planes and satellites aren't going to be doing that. Well, lo and behold, at the very end of the evening, we got a very deliberate and delineated pulse above us, which is really cool, and it's always great to see. On my last night, which was Tuesday night of this week, I went out, very hopeful, and what I saw were the most starcraft in one night I've ever seen. I saw at least 26, potentially 27 starcraft, all moving from the west into the northeast on the same vector, the same azimuth, which I found interesting. And of course, I'm always asking, could you drop down in altitude? And typically, they were traversing the sky at about 7,000 feet. About three craft dropped to about 5 to 4,000 feet, and that was very interesting because what I observed was a certainly a silent, intelligently piloted starcraft, but at a very low energy level, and it had two red dots, two red lights on it, like that, like that. And the ship was not energized, but it was clearly piloted and clearly structural, and you could just delineate geometry, but it didn't come any closer. For the rest of that evening, for the last 45 minutes, I began to see, because they were not allowed to strobe, they began to do that wiggle and that signature. Yes, we acknowledge what you're asking, but we can't respond the way you want. And or very often you'll see one stop, start, accelerate, and trying to indicate that yes, there is a causal response to your ask or your request, but we can't honor it. So that was really cool. Wednesday night, I returned to Greenland, in New Hampshire, in the Great Bay, and I walk outside, and again, right by the Cygnus constellation, which seems to be extremely busy, Cygnus and the Big Dipper, in that corridor, I've seen roughly 40 starcraft in the last week, which is pretty cool. And so, I'm watching them do their thing. Sometimes they wiggle, sometimes they slow down, sometimes they accelerate. And I was painting them again with that really low power D cell flashlight. And something really unique happened, or hasn't happened in about a decade. I painted, starcraft approaching, and if here's the pulse, the starcraft went woo, around like that. And I mentally apologized. I'm like, sorry, didn't mean to spook you, because 2 to 3 miles across the Great Bay is Pease Air Force Base, and I'm sure they have higher power directed energy technology that I wouldn't want painting my ship. And the last thing I'd like to say, Martin, is, I know everyone's frustrated, and I've began to notice in myself and others a level of exhaustion, a level of tiredness that sleep doesn't seem to help or address or refreshen. And one of the things I heard on GFL that I found interesting and wanted to share with you is that is the star seeds recognition that their mission is probably coming to an end, and the soul, all of our souls, are yearning for a higher order level of consciousness and experience, e.g., world that is either here, very imminently approaching. And I've also found personally that my interest in the 3D world has is really taken a back seat in the bus, and that there are more interesting and more valuable things to pursue. And I think, in this transition time, when we see a lot of confetti and chaff of dying systems literally being devolved and moved on, we're also moving on in our consciousness, and we want to embrace a world that has higher empathy, higher spirituality, higher love, and higher connectedness to all life, and ultimately, even to the ones who are still asleep, to everyone, because we're all brothers and sisters, and that's really where this is headed, but at different rates, and that's some of the difficult part of this. One of the most important things we can all do is focus internally on our own rate of development, because that will hasten your realization and your consciousness that 4D and 5D are already here. We're holding ourselves back. And by getting rid of some of the 3D constructs, 3D thinking and conditioning, which they've been very good at, that allows and empties the space within us to allow 4D and 5D to come more quickly and fill in the superficial 3D model that we'd like to move on from. I'll just speak personally, but I'm sure that's probably universal in terms of the soul's higher order desire. Because when we are in deep sleep, we are home. And my teacher said, in waking state of consciousness, everyone's hypnotized. Everyone thinks this is real. I know that sounds crazy. If you think something is so real, it becomes more solid. And so the higher order thought we can introduce in our waking state of consciousness, the faster a higher order world, in my experience and opinion, will approach.